Hi, everybody. Welcome to our GIA seminar today on the promise and perils of using leaked and sensitive data to research illicit finance. We're just going to wait one more minute for a couple more people to join, and then we'll get started. Okay, welcome everybody. This is the GIA seminar, The Promise and Perils of Using Leaked and Sensitive Data to Research Illicit Finance. I'm Liz Dávid-Barrett. I'm a professor at the University of Sussex and the director of the GIACE programme. And this is a seminar that we're running in collaboration with the Illicit Finance Data Lab. And that is itself a collaboration between the Anti-Corruption Data Collective and the Organised Crime and Corruption Reporting Project. So I will spare you any more acronyms. But I did want to say that at the GIA's programme, we're all about creating rigorous evidence around what works in anti-corruption. And of course, the programme has been running for more than 10 years now. And across that, we've seen that, in fact, we've had a number of great research projects which have been really innovative in terms of the data that they collect and the data that they use for the research. And so today's seminar is one of two that we're doing with the Illicit Finance Data Lab, where we're really trying to explore some of the challenges of using different forms of data, particularly in this case, leaked and sensitive data, but also the opportunities that it presents. So we don't yet have the date for the second seminar, but do look out for that. And in fact, do subscribe to our GIACE newsletter. We'll put the link in the chat. On to today. So we have two great speakers today. We've got David Szakonyi, who is an associate professor of political science and international affairs at George Washington University. And he is running one of the GIA's projects, which looks specifically at lessons from analysing a huge leak of 3.5 million documents from BGFI Bank in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And that's a huge data leak. I'm sure he's going to tell us more about it, but they're looking at that to try and understand how that cross-border trade and money laundering was working. So he's going to talk for 10 minutes about some insights from using leaked data in that project. And then we've got Tom Mayne, who is a research fellow at the University of Exeter, working on another GIA's project with John Heathershaw and Tenor Prelitz. And that project is around identifying enabler networks and other vulnerabilities and using data gathered from investigative journalism. So he's also going to talk for 10 minutes about that project. Then we'll have a couple of questions from me and we'll open up to the floor. So if, as you're listening, do think about what questions you'd like to ask them both or what you'd like to share in terms of your own experiences of using this kind of sensitive and leaked data. We really like to get a conversation going here and start building up a community of people who are both on the academic or the journalism side, thinking about how to use this kind of data. So I will not speak for any longer, but let's hand over to David. And David, if you'd like to share your screen. Great. Over to you.
Great. Thanks so much for the nice introduction, and great to be here this morning with all of you to talk about our experience working with leaked data. As I said, I'm a professor at George Washington University and also help run the Anti-Corruption Data Collective, which is one of the partners on this project. So I want to kind of talk with the academic motivation because this is a more of an academic seminar. And, basically every single presentation on illicit financial flows talks about how much of a threat they are worldwide and the trillions of dollars that are laundered or that flow through the illicit economy every year around the world. And that really comes at a massive cost developmentally. So if you think about trade-based money laundering or other different types of cryptocurrency schemes, there's just a massive, massive expense and a lot of resources that governments around the world cannot tap because kleptocratic actors or other types of criminal networks are funneling them abroad. So I'm sure everybody on the call is potentially interested in a related question about how dirty money moves around the world. But specifically, the last kind of 4 or 5 years, there's been a couple main questions motivating my academic research, which is kind of like the how and what can be done. So the first is we really don't have great visibility into how illicit financial flows cross borders. We've got some pretty prominent case studies that have illuminated a bit of the different types of enablers and entities that have accepted or facilitated dirty money flows. But in general, we have a very, very limited visibility into how money moves. And then potentially more importantly, one of my bullets got cut off. There's a wide range of policy solutions that have been floated in order to kind of improve the global anti-money laundering system, but we don't have a lot of good evidence about what works and what doesn't. So, for example, I'll be talking in this talk about de-risking, which in other words is cutting off malicious actors from accessing financial infrastructure. So the idea of if you know somebody's a bad actor, we need to kind of pigeonhole or restrict their access to all the SWIFT or other types of different systems that move money. Another one is to fix opacity. So includes like beneficial ownership registries and information sharing, but also even encouraging whistleblowers so that we learn more about how different actors are using the systems around the world. And then another could be more like building monitoring or due diligence capacity within different enabling financial institutions, whether they be banks or corporate service providers, or even kind of international regulators, so they have a better scope of what's going on. But all of these kind of policy solutions are really hard to analyze because historically there's been very little, especially quantitative data available to evaluate or analyze differences or comparing different solutions and seeing what actually reduces illicit financial flow. So that's kind of where this project came from, which is we've got a huge problem. We have some ideas about how to fix it, but we haven't had a lot of data in order to kind of analyze what works and what doesn't. So I'm going to structure my talk around the promises and the perils and go back and forth. So one of the big promises of the last decade, or where I think we're celebrating 10 years this year, is that there's just been this enormous number of journalistic leaks that have revealed incredible secrets about how this world works. And all of us are familiar with all the different projects on the screen right now, and we can add to that list another dozen or so, right? There seems to be this abundance of leaked data floating around the world that suddenly this hidden money land has become a little bit more visible to all the rest of us trying to investigate it. But with that promise comes this peril, which is that historically there's been a lot of skepticism among these big journalistic projects about sharing the data with academics or really anybody outside the journalistic community. So when we look at the scale of these leaks, and this is one kind of snapshot about how much data is contained in many of these high profile investigations, we're looking about terabytes and terabytes of data, emails, invoices, documents, all types of correspondence, you name it. Presumably all of it is in these leaked files. However, only a very small fraction of structured data has been made available by, for example, ICIJ through its Offshore Leaks project to the wider public. So it seems like if you go to the website, you get the full picture, but really there's terabytes, like, I mean, thousands of times more data that are being stored on the servers. And only journalists so far have been given full access in order to analyze and write stories on them. And part of that, as far as we can tell, is that there's this perception that academics and civil society both cannot be trusted to, for example, protect the data integrity, right? Protect the sources, protect the privacy of people that are in the leak, that there is no public interest. And even further, that we've been told that academics may have a misguided or incomplete notion of what is in the public interest. Journalists have had all this training about which stories are worth pursuing, and maybe academics aren't really attuned to some of those different nuances or are biased in the way that they approach the analysis. So therefore, we need to kind of restrict their access because they can't be trusted to use it properly. And I think in general, there is a bit of a skepticism that data scientists or academics historically can contribute new knowledge. We're kind of trapped in our silos. We ask narrow questions, and we're really, even giving us access to the leak isn't going to produce anything that transformative or something that the journalists themselves can't do. So, with this promise of basically seemingly unlimited leaked data, only a very small portion has been made available for some kind of professed reasons from the journalistic community. Now, this project is one of the first types of collaboration where we've convinced basically the holders of the leak that there's value in sharing it more broadly. So I'll tell you a little bit about the leak, and then I'll tell you a little bit about how it came together. So first, this project is going to be focusing on the Congo holdup leak, which is the largest one from the financial at the African continent to date. And it was given to PLOF and Mediapart. So PLOF is the Project to Protect Whistleblowers in Africa. And Mediapart is another one of these international journalistic organizations that brings together journalists from around Europe, but actually around the world now. So there are over 3.5 million documents leaked from BGFI Bank DRC, and this is the seventh largest bank by size in the country at the time, and very central to the country's political economy. So it's owned by a relative of the then President Kabila, and very kind of important for funneling money abroad, as over 100 stories were written about politically connected persons and firms exploiting and abusing the bank's access to international financial infrastructure in order to move millions and millions of money abroad. So this leak kind of had the classic buildup. There was an initial dump of documents. They were shared with 23 media outlets, but also some NGOs, which is kind of atypical in this space. And then I think there were 19 different languages that the stories were ultimately published in back in 2021 that kind of exposed the extent of malfeasance going on. But what was interesting about this is that the people that received the leak and organized the investigation realized that after that first wave, there was a lot more work to be done potentially, and that academics and other people with data science skills might be able to help uncover some of the new stories, new investigations that just there wasn't enough time, wasn't enough interest in the first kind of hurried round of investigations. So the NGO kind of held the data, and they were much more open to sharing it broadly. And also because maybe the news cycle or the mindset was a little bit different than a conventional journalistic organization, they were interested in working on this leak for years to come rather than moving on to the next story. And therefore, they kind of reached out to us at Anti-Corruption Data Collective. They saw that we had kind of posted online that we were interested in working with leaks and doing this type of work. And they thought, look, if we really believe in collaboration, why don't we bring in more people to the project and see what else we can find by tapping other people's skill sets that might be complementary to what we had before. So that was the promise of that, like, especially when these leaks are held by more collaborative organizations, and there are some journalists that have this mindset, you can potentially work on things longer, extend the news cycle, and squeeze more relevant insights out of the information. Now, of course, that promise comes with a new type of peril, which is that we're dealing with extremely sensitive data, right? And ethical and security considerations abound in this banking dump. So first is that there's just heaps of PII, personally identifiable information, and there are many individuals for whom there is no demonstrable public interest. They were just normal clients of the bank, and their information is included just like all the other presidential representatives or government officials that are in there. So that creates a lot of sensitivity and also a lot of concerns that we can't just release this data out into the wild. And also, there is a whistleblower that still is at risk of retribution, the originator of the leak. And so, very little, if anything, is known about this person, but there are strict rules and guidelines about how to manage the data in order not to increase any attention or scrutiny into this person and reduce any backlash for producing the leak. So, that created a whole host of problems, especially from my side as an academic. And it took me two and a half attempts to get my university's institutional review board to approve my access to the data. There was a lot of skepticism among lawyers at my university about how I received this data, where it came from originally, what the value of this data was. There was just this kind of most of these institutional review boards are involved in health studies. They don't really understand how PII could be used to expose corruption or criminality. And even when they came to that conclusion that it could be, they were really concerned about lawsuits or putting the university at risk. I think most of those concerns were unfounded, but this was their first experience with this type of data, and they, I think, handled it with extreme caution. And at first were very reticent to even move forward on this. In order to get their approval, I've had to go through extremely strict data processing requirements and have a secure server that has a number of different checks and a number of different even people in the chain to approve different transactions between myself and the server to make sure that everything is protected from the outside world. So it's not like this data is easy to analyze or access because of these conditions. So I want to say that working with leaked data requires a lot of care and a lot of thought in order both to convince higher ups or convince lawyers that it's worth doing, but also convince them that you're capable and responsible with the data. The final thing is that even with the NGO PLOF that we have such a good relationship with and collaborating in the investigation, there's still ongoing negotiations about what we can and can publish at the end of the day. And not just for libel reasons, but really more because of the whistleblower, that we don't want to reveal too much about, certain aspects that could put the whistleblower at risk. So that peril leads to a different type of promise, of course, which is that this is it offers incredible insights into the way that the international banking system works. And I won't talk into full length about what we're finding as we build this data, but in general, what we're seeing is something that we've never been able to observe in publicly available or even like very expensive data sets, which is how a subsidiary bank or how a domestic bank interacts with the global system and really the correspondent banking relationship. So just in one sentence, in order for a bank like BGFI to send transactions abroad, they need to work with other larger banks in the global north to clear dollar transactions. Citibank, Bank of America, Deutsche Bank, all of them have access to dollars and really are kind of key nodes in the system. And they have contracts or arrangements with banks around the world saying you can use us to send transactions abroad. You probably have sent some of these things and had to put in your correspondent bank. We can observe these relationships and have been able to see which transactions flow through different correspondent banks. The plot in front of you shows different correspondent banks, each is a different color. And we're looking at a shock when one of the correspondent banks decided it didn't want to work with this bank anymore. What happens to the flows of money and how it shifts across different actors? Does it go up and to go down? So really, we see this kind of leaked data as one of the few opportunities that we have in order to kind of observe how different banks talk to each other, how they communicate about different transactions, how they assess risk, and so forth. But of course, that comes with another peril, which is that this is messy, messy, messy data. There are just millions of unstructured documents describing transactions and invoices and emails. And so that's one problem of like, how do we get this into a state that we can actually do some quantitative analysis because it's not there yet? And then the second is that this is a kind of a narrow window. It's one bank out of many in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And this is a kind of a low state capacity jurisdiction, and there aren't that many other external data sets to help us fill out the picture. We're really dependent on the leak itself. For example, we've tried to think about bringing in the corporate registry, but even that is really hard to complete. And trying to get in some trade data from the Congo Customs Office, but that really doesn't start until maybe last year. So it doesn't really help us figure out what's going on with regards to the specific leaked data that we have in our possession. So we try to come up with some kind of curious and innovative solutions, especially like offline LLMs, where we don't have to use the big providers and we have control over our data in order to start to get unstructured data into more structured form. And then also being really narrow and specific about what we're studying and trying to develop new measures that are based just on the banking data. Those are different red flags than are usually used in the kind of wider scholarship, but there's nothing we can do because we don't have access to, or the data is missing about a lot of the other red flags that some of the other investigative teams have been using. So I'll kind of just finish there with this promise because I think it's an incredible opportunity, but I don't want to kind of paint it too negatively and turn people off to the ideas of working with leaked data. One of the neatest things about this project is that we've had a multi-talented team at our disposal through PLOF, but also journalists that are affiliated with, is that when I have a question about how the correspondent banking world works, I can get on a Signal chat and ask somebody and get an answer within an hour, or get a contact at a bank or at a different kind of expert group or even in country to answer questions I have about either the data or about correspondent banking or some of the other research projects we're working on. That's not something I could easily do with a bunch of my other academic projects where I wasn't embedded in a team of people all working toward the same goal. So I think that's a really unique advantage of working with these leaked data and collaborating with other types of institutions. The other thing is that we're really working towards a diverse set of outputs, that there is this built-in broader audience for the work. I think as a function of the fact there was such a big investigation now 5 years ago. So a lot of people are aware of the leak, they followed the first time it came out, and they're interested about what comes in next. And that also means that we've got to be a little bit more flexible in what we're producing through the GIA's project. So there's going to be policy briefs and maybe even some new investigative stories alongside the academic works because we're seeing new things arise from the data that we never had seen before that have real value and public interest, as well as analyzing some of the policy tools and have people being really interested because no one's had this access before to the way that these correspondent banking relationships, for example, work. So it kind of forced us in a good way to think beyond just a typical academic article because there's just so many other stakeholders that are immediately invested in the leak. So my hope is, of course, that these two things will lead to greater impact from the work. Things are still a work in progress, and we've got a lot more to do. But I think that's one of the main appeals of working with this leaked data is that there's just so much more potential that you can kind of influence the way that the policies are trotted out. So I'll stop there and happy to answer more questions at the end of the session.
That's great. Thanks so much, David. So really fascinating, but hold your questions for now. We're going to hear now from Tom. Tom, are you ready to share your slides?
Yep, I think so.
Fantastic. Over to you.
How's that looking?
Yeah, we can see your notes as well, but I don't think that matters.
No, that's the. That's okay, isn't it? I've got
Yeah.
no. I've not got any notes. So.
Oh, we can see the next slide. Sorry. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
fine. Yeah.
Perfect. That'll do me. Yeah. So hello everyone. It's great to be here. And I think we didn't plan this, but the two presentations I think work quite well. David has presented an academic overview where we are with the study of illicit finance, and he's presented something quite large scale and macro. Mine is the opposite. It's very micro. It involves really one set of kleptocratic network, a single kleptocratic network. It is journalistic almost in its investigative techniques, rather than these large scale data projects, which I'm not a data scientist, are a little bit beyond me. I also have to admit to cheating a little bit in my presentation, in that the case study I'm going to talk about is regarding a case study I published with an NGO called Freedom for Eurasia in Vienna. It involves a data set that is available on the ALEF database and is very much part of my ongoing ACE research. So it is kind of part of my current work as well, but the report I'm going to talk about is separate. So what is the ALEF or the ALEF database? It's a huge database created by the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project. It contains over 400 million, maybe even more documents now from a variety of places. Has been used by OCCRP and now others. It's publicly available. At least certain amount of the information is publicly available if you sign up. And through this database, you can do some great investigations. And part of my work through GIACE is to look at this database and to see what we can come up with in terms of finding out investigations, finding out information about kleptocrats and how they launder illicit finance using enablers in the West. So the Aleph database, as I say, it contains an incredible amount of information. Some of it is public. There's some media reports in there, some NGO reports from Global Witness and other organizations. There's data sets such as land registry, so not land registry, company registry documents. But they're also it's great because it has aggregated a lot of the famous leaks that David mentioned, the Panama Papers, the offshore leaks, and so on. But it is quite unwieldy with over 400 million documents. Even with a good search engine, it's going to be difficult to sometimes to come up with what you want. And I have an example of that coming up. The data set I want to talk about is little known, perhaps, compared to some of the others, because it features just one country, the Central Asian nation of Kazakhstan. And this is when, in 2014, thousands of emails belonging to various Kazakh officials were hacked and leaked and put online whole scale. So you have full email threads and file attachments. The government of Kazakhstan attempted to prevent reporting of these emails, but there was a legal case in the US which stated that anyone not involved in the theft could report on the contents of these emails. That doesn't necessarily mean that there aren't some perils in dealing with this data set, but it's very useful in using this data set when we're looking at specific examples of corruption in a kleptocracy such as Kazakhstan. And the investigation I embarked on with Freedom for Eurasia was regarding the former Prime Minister of Kazakhstan, Karim Masimov, Prime Minister on two occasions. His final position in Kazakhstan was chairman of the National Security Committee, which is the successor organization to the KGB in Soviet times. He was a close associate of the former president, but fell out of favor and then was jailed a few years ago on charges of treason. He was accused of fomenting unrest and even trying to launch a coup d'etat against the current president, Tokayev. Basically, in this investigation, what we wanted to show was that Masimov's spending was far outstripping what he could earn as a state official. He's been a state official for over 20 years. We estimated his salary maximum of about $100,000 a year. If you're a Kazakh official, you aren't allowed to do any other kind of money-making enterprise. So really, his spending should be in line with his salary. But using these leaked emails from KazaWord, that's not what we found. However, before we get to KazaWord, an example of perhaps sometimes where you come up dry, even with a database as extensive as the Aleph database, we had a look at Masimov's extended family. Here's his wife's family, and there were no hits really in the Aleph database, which shows that either just the information's not there, or that Masimov wasn't using his wife's family necessarily as proxies for corruption. But what was in the database via the KazaWord data leak were hundreds of emails about Masimov and some of his activities. So there's this one, which is a hotel bill from Paris from March 2010 to 12, £10,482. But even if you have this email, of course, you can't just accept it at face value. You have to do extensive research to make sure that to really, as much as you can, that the document is accurate. I think it's much more difficult if somebody comes to you with a single document and is trying to kind of tell you a story based on this document. I would be treating that person with a certain amount of skepticism, and I'd be asking them about that document. When you have these leaks, which are thousands and thousands of documents, and no one's necessarily even noticed this particular file, you're perhaps on a little bit more steady ground. But of course, you still need to go quite a distance in order to try and verify that information. So in the case of the hotel bill, we looked at other hotel bills online. The one on left is unrelated to the case, but seems to match the one on the right. Of course, that doesn't mean that somebody can't add a couple of zeros. But we also can do other things like just checking the dates. Was Masimov in Kazakhstan at that time? We found some information. Basically, someone had uploaded one of his diaries, which suggested he wasn't in Kazakhstan, or at least there was no evidence to suggest he was in Kazakhstan on those dates. And we went as far as we could to try and verify the information contained in that bill. And as a reporter with a kind of journalistic background, an investigator, you're looking for any interesting details which might help in the reporting, make it kind of pop a little bit and be a bit more interesting to people who are not familiar with the subject. So here we have 1,300 euros spent in the minibar, the 25 euro spent on a Rubik's Cube suggests that this was perhaps a family holiday. And indeed, we could find no evidence that there was any kind of stated visit to France at that time. Interestingly, though, another email we found was that the invoice had been sent to the embassy, the Kazakh embassy in Paris. Now, if this is a personal visit on behalf of Masimov, why is the Kazakh embassy in Paris getting involved? It raises some interesting questions. And the person responsible for dealing with this invoice, and of course we don't know who paid for it, was a Kazakh official called Jan Galiev. And Jan Galiev also comes up in another set of emails where it looks like these officials are discussing finding some Napoleon letters for Masimov to purchase. And they find in a Parisian bookshop 3 letters, one of which is worth 85,000 euros. And there's some interesting things in these emails. The seller even began to say that he was afraid of harassment from the bank and the authorities. So it's a good signpost of perhaps impropriety. Again, we don't know the full story. We're trying to check everything we can. We don't know who paid for it, but 85,000 euros would be beyond Masimov's salary. So if he bought them personally, then it raises questions over where this money comes from. If it was paid by someone else, then this could easily be a bribe. So even though we might not have all the answers, we're asking the right questions. In one of the emails, there's some talk of you can see in the bottom quote there, the letters being sent to Kazakhstan via diplomatic mail. So in a kind of a secret system, and handed over personally to someone called Orenbayev. Now, there is an individual with the surname Orenbayev who is a former deputy prime minister of Kazakhstan. We can't say it's him, though, because we only have the surname. It could be a relative. It could be somebody with the same surname. But again, we can ask that question. Indeed, as part of our due diligence process or opportunity to comment process, we wrote to all the people in question to ask them if they had comments on these findings. And we wrote to the deputy prime minister, former deputy prime minister Orenbayev, who didn't reply. But at least we're going to that extra degree to ensure that the documents that we are using, we have checked out as much as we can. We also found a bill for medical treatment, $313,000, where 6 people were flown, 6 medical personnel were flown from the United States to Kazakhstan. The name of the person who received the treatment isn't on the bill. They're just referred to as Mr. X, but it was sent to Masimov's personal assistant, Talant Muratbayev, suggesting it may well have been him. Also, the invoice was sent to Masimov's assistant by someone working at a steel company in Kazakhstan. And that raises the question again, why is this employee of a steel company getting involved in what should be a personal payment? All of these documents are available not just on the Aleph database, but elsewhere in a completely unredacted form. So they are available. But what we wanted to do was, if we referred to a document in the report, we wanted to put it up as a reference so people can see what we're referring to. Then people can do their own research. They can maybe even spot any inconsistencies or any problems with the documents that we might not have noticed. We're not infallible. We're very happy to make any corrections after the report has been published. But it did raise some questions about, do we redact, even though these documents are available elsewhere unredacted, do we personally redact any information? It's interesting thinking about, David was talking about personally identifiable information. If you're under 30, you might not remember this, but even 20 years ago, everybody in the UK would receive a book, the phone directory, and in it there would be every single body's personal address and phone number. You could apply to be removed from it, but very few people did. So it shows you how our viewpoints of what constitutes personally identifiable information has changed over the years. Basically, we took the view that we should redact phone numbers, email addresses, if there's actually a program you can use which suggests whether an email address is still in use. And if it was still in use, we would redact it. Here, there was some information about medical treatment, but as it wasn't actually a medical report, and it was a large amount of money related to what is very likely either Masimov or the president of Kazakhstan, we felt that that information shouldn't be redacted. And as I say, we placed it as a reference to the eventual report. Finally, now, I think it was important to combine what we find in leaked documents with other information where we can. I've not really talked about the origins of the money, but a large part of the eventual report talks about allegations that Masimov used a proxy in various business dealings in order to earn money. This person, Aygul Nuriyeva, we have information that she allegedly received a bribe on behalf of Masimov. So that's where the illicit finance comes into it. And through other data, not leaked data, but open source and some non-open source investigation, using the land registry documents, for example, in the UK, we found that Nuriyeva has various properties, including this very nice piece of land in Cannes, which again suggests, even though she's a businesswoman, she is perhaps, working on behalf of someone else. And finally, David was talking a little bit about how do we, as academics, try and get the information out there about these findings. This particular report, which, as I say, was done through the NGO Freedom for Eurasia, we did manage to get it covered in the Daily Telegraph in the UK, solely because, as part of the Kazaword data leak, was a previously unseen photo of Tony Blair with Masimov. And even though Blair is not involved in the corruption at all with Masimov, and is really mentioned in the report just so we could put this photo in, that photo allowed us to get covered in the Telegraph. I don't think it would have been otherwise. So that allows us to get more attention to the report. We're asking for certain things in the report about use of sanctions, perhaps new legislation to tackle kleptocracy. We use something we found in the database as a way to get more eyes on the report, even though, strictly speaking, Blair isn't in this story at all. But it shows you that sometimes you need to do these things in order to, get more eyes to the story you've created. So I'm going to leave it there. I'm going to be very interested in your questions. We've had two very different kinds of presentations here, but hopefully they link together, and we can see what happens in the Q&A. Thanks a lot.
Absolutely. Thanks, Tom. Really fascinating. And as you say, quite different approaches. I wonder if anybody has questions. If you do have a question, then you can raise your hand and I'll come to you and you can ask it. Or if you'd rather not or can't speak, you can type your question in the chat and I'll read it out. But in the meantime, I have a couple of questions for you just to kick things off. So sort of a couple of topics that you both kind of talk about or got me thinking about. So one is around verification, and one is around sort of completeness of the data. So it was quite fascinating to see in Tom's presentation how you'd go and verify whether this is likely to be a real invoice from the Ritz, trying to find different invoices online. I was thinking, David, what's the sort of equivalent of that for a big data leak? How do you know that this big leak is real data? What are the sort of risks that, it could be something that's being leaked for political reasons? And relatedly, the issue of completeness. So how do you know what you're looking at is representative, or maybe you just accept that it's not, but you don't really know what you don't know? So, again, thinking about Tom saying you don't find Masimov's family in the data set, does that really tell us anything? Or how are your findings limited by the fact that this data is sort of incomplete? Reflections from either of you on that. Let's maybe go to David first.
Sure. And I don't think I have great answers because those are, in some ways, insolvable questions. The first one is about how do you know what you have is real? I mean, the only mechanism you have is, like Tom hinted at, is to validate against other data sources that exist outside the leak and compare wherever you can to see if things match up. If they don't match up, for example, we're trying to validate against some trade documents that we have in our possession to say, look, was there a trade document connected to this invoice to this different transaction? Did a good actually move borders? If there's not that customs or declaration, does that mean that we're missing the customs declaration, or does that mean that they never filled out one in the first place and therefore this is just a fraudulent transaction without an invoice? So even having complementary data set, if there's incompleteness in that external one, you're left with basically the same set of concerns. By being in the second wave of this Congo holdup investigation, I think our concerns about like politically motivated or falsified documents are a little bit lessened. I mean, there have been so many journalists that have had access to this data set and published articles that have stood up in court, right? So that I think I'm less concerned about there being random documents that have just kind of been planted as ruses. But if I was to be involved into kind of like a new investigation where there was a leak that had never really been scrutinized or that was just in the early stages, I think the validation approach would probably be the most reasonable and the one pursued by all the different people on the project, saying like, if this does this comport with how we think the world works or how we think these invoices are drafted or other email records that we have, and if not, let's dig in and maybe even shelve this project because we think we're being taken for a ride. And then in terms of representativeness, I got this question a couple of weeks ago, which is, look, you're looking at the seventh largest bank in a very captured economy, and one that is probably the closest to the ruling administration. What does this even tell us about correspondent banks in general? Like if you find a pattern at BGFI Bank and the way that they substituted or evaded or exploited loopholes, does that mean that every single banking officer, even in the DRC, much less Sub-Saharan Africa or the Global South, operates in the same way? And I can't make those claims, right? What we're offering is a single data point, what we think is an illustrative example of a captured bank. And what we're trying to do is say that, for example, in our specific use case, that there are these captured banks basically in every single autocracy or kleptocracy around the world. And we're trying to identify patterns that we're seeing in one country as motivation for other people studying captured banks to see if they see the same things going on. So we can build a new type of knowledge base and really assess differences across countries. But because captured banks are still kind of a new or kind of unheard of object of study in a comprehensive way, we're kind of paving ground with the full recognition that in 10 years, people could say this is totally anomalous. It was interesting to spend time on this, but this is just a outlier bank and our knowledge has shifted in the other direction. And I think that's the only way you really accumulate expertise. It's just by doing things robustly and then sharing them with other people and letting other people kind of do parallel studies to see whether they match up with their experience. But I don't think we have better best practices than that right now.
It's great. And I think, again, one of the things we really want to do here is showcase and sort of illustrate some of this for people who are doing this kind of work. It seems something that is so hard that it's really important to get the conversation going about how other people are tackling these issues. Tom, any reflections on those?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, certainly with the CasaWord leak, I think there probably were political motivations behind the leak. Perhaps we know a certain amount of information about who was responsible, either journalists or maybe opposition-linked journalists or opposition, Kazakh opposition. But that, though you perhaps put a question mark over the motivations, that doesn't necessarily mean you have to question everything in the data set, because clearly it would be implausible for someone to forge 10,000 emails with the attachments. That's not to say, as I said in my presentation, that there might not be issues with the data. You might get, garble messages. You might have a bill that was never paid. You might have a something that it was talked about but never happened. I mean, not wanting to mention the Epstein files, but if you kind of go on Blue Sky and Twitter, the debate that's going on there is in a completely different universe to what's being talked about on the BBC, because those files, because there's millions of them, they contain lots of allegations which are very hard to verify. They may have happened, they may not have happened, but they're hard to verify. What we tried to do with the CasaWord leak is really concentrate on a paper trail where you can actually follow a transaction through and see that there was evidence of some kind of payment. And then, even though we might not be able to say who paid it, raise some questions about why this is problematic when you have a public official like Masimov involved. So there are lots of issues, but as I say, the fact that there's tens of thousands is actually in your favor, because it's very unlikely that for that data to have been wholly falsified if it's at that scale.
Great, thank you very much. Okay, we're going to go to Mara now for a question. Mara, would you like to ask
Hello.
your question?
Yes, hello, thank you. Thank you so much for two very interesting presentations. I have two very brief questions, one for Tom and one for David. For David, can you say a little bit more about approval from the ethics board? How long did this process take you? The two times you asked for approval, and for Tom, you mentioned the use of Aleph, which is very rich, but at the same time hard to search what you want. Can you elaborate a little bit more on what was hard about it? How could it be easier? And also perhaps more generally, for what kind of research you would recommend Aleph, this type of case studies, or perhaps also different types of research questions. So that's, yeah.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Mara. I'm also going to throw in there the questions that are in the chat, so then we can take them as a cluster. So in the chat, we've got Marty Medina saying, could David explain a little more about how he used LLMs for his research? Does that count as sharing information with OpenAI, Google, or other famous AI companies? Karok Mohammed has asked, can corruption-related data, including data on IFFs, be reframed away from a scandal-driven and investigative logic toward a structured public policy use? Is it possible to transform such data from a tool of naming and shaming into an instrument for risk mapping that might inform regulatory design and preventive oversight? How can AI help analyze corruption and illicit finance data more effectively? And then we also have Avisa Gusti asking, David, could you explain a bit the possible analyses that the team can do without being able to link to other data sets? So shall we go to David first again and then Tom?
Great, thanks for the questions. So for the approval for, and again, this is maybe specific to American universities, we have an institutional review board, an IRB. There's a very set of questions, a template that you have to fill out about what you're trying to do, and also the risks is what to human subjects that might be incurred through the research. I initially approached it not cavalierly, but quite confidently. This was data that had been shared quite broadly. There were sensitivities around it, but we also had a plan, and we were kind of aware of what to do and what not to do, and kind of filled it out, thinking that my university would just be excited about us breaking new ground. They pushed back or actually kind of declined to participate initially because of I think they were concerned about the criminality of the data, like the idea that this was illegally acquired hit all these red flags within lawyer minds, saying that there's no reason or purpose to use this type of um, since the owner of the data didn't give us permission to analyze it, we couldn't do anything with it. That was the kind of logic that they built off of. And then when we went back the second time, we brought in a lot more evidence saying, look, this was a whistleblower. There was an intentionality behind the leaking. There's a lot of value for the greater good or public interest that we can learn from this. We're not the first people to kind of tackle these issues. And in some ways, we had to convince the university lawyers that they weren't smarter than all the lawyers that had worked on the first wave investigation, because they basically acted like no one else had seen this data or dealt with these questions, and they were the first people, and this was their verdict. So it had to kind of integrate a lot of the learnings from the first wave and kind of very easily hold their hands to say this isn't as dangerous, this is much more useful than you think it is, and there's precedent to what you're doing. And I think once they heard that there was precedent, they got more comfortable with it. And then finally, I just had to work with my university and the kind of the IT team who does this all the time, because there's all types of sensitive projects at GW, but they're more about health, to kind of access the systems we have to protect this type of personal information. As clunky as they are, as far as I can tell, they're quite effective. For the LLMs, there is this kind of parallel open source movement to all the major providers, and there's a lot of people that are designing new programs to work without accessing the internet, because they're aware that a lot of people don't want to share their data with Meta, Google, OpenAI, Anthropic, you name it. So you can download a lot of the weights if you want to do some kind of off-the-shelf type stuff and just run it really quickly and basically have your own LLM working on your machine or on your server. Or you can train an LLM really easily these days and say, I'm going to code up a lot of emails, a lot of invoices. I'm going to feed it to an LLM and have it do all the work. And I've even shut down all access of my computer to the web, like put on a firewall, just to be extra, extra secure on another project that there was no kind of interfacing with the internet. With this one, we're working on a server that's all cut off anyways, but even on your own computer, if you don't have access to a really protected server, you can just basically make your laptop a brick, run everything on it, and then be confident that no big corporation is getting access to your data. And all this is for free, and it's just kind of the open source movement. And then the last one is, how much can you do without external data sets? I think surprisingly a lot. There's a lot of patterns and there's a lot of things that exist solely within. It just takes a lot more time to kind of go down the rabbit hole and find the emails and invoices and documents and other types of accompanying information in order to tell the story. So I think we initially thought that if we just merged in a lot of external data sets, we could make a lot of progress really quickly. And then we realized that wouldn't work. So we just got to slow things down and fully exploit the raw information that we have in a way that maybe we weren't expecting to in the beginning. And we thought that maybe we'd get away without digging in. And we learned our lesson, and it's just going to be a little bit slower than we initially planned. But that's probably specific to every single leak.
That's great, thanks. And interesting, just sort of on the previous point, it's good to know that a lot of this can be done for free, because sometimes when you talk about the extensive checks and security and privacy concerns, it got me thinking, do you then need a huge resource for this? But it sounds like you don't. That's good to hear. Tom.
Sure. See if I can remember everything. I think Maya's question, I think it was Maya, about Aleph database. What are the issues that? Simply because it's just so huge. So if you have somebody with a fairly common name, or somebody who's been involved in a lot of stuff, be it Putin or Gulnara Karimova, for example, the daughter of the former Uzbek president, you're just going to get so many hits. Now, Aleph is quite good in that you can eliminate certain data sets if you feel that something is not really relevant. But it is just so huge. A lot of it will involve just kind of scrolling through and delving into documents that you won't really know what they are. It is a bit like that old kids game, the lucky dip. You put your hand in and what you're going to get out. But you do find some gems in there. I'm doing some research on a particular Kazakh businessman who is convicted for something in Kazakhstan, and I thought, oh, how am I going to get his conviction document from Kazakhstan? You know, notoriously hard to get. I'm going to have to be contacting somebody in Kazakhstan. Oh, I find it in the Aleph database. So it is great for that kind of research that I do, which is about specific individuals, specific things, specific close networks of people. I found it very useful for looking at wealth managers who've registered a lot of companies, because what Aleph does is put together a lot of the company registries, so you can actually see, rather than going to individual company registers, someone who having registered 10, 20 companies in various jurisdictions. And that's why I think, just on mention of AI, I think that's maybe going to be the future of this kind of research, allowing AI and getting these LLMs to taking a huge data set and saying, oh, here's some findings. There is one company which actually owns 100 companies, and if we link that to another data set that company is owned by a Russian oligarch and it's previously unknown. I think that would be very interesting to look at in the future. Kadok's question about corruption-related data, can it be transformed into an instrument for risk mapping, regulatory design, and routine preventative oversight? Well, I think that work is going on part of the ACE project. People are doing that kind of work. But just to kind of defend the method that I've used over the years, for me, by looking at individual cases of kleptocrats, you can then extrapolate out and come up with some conclusions that are useful when it comes to regulatory design and risk mapping. And just to give you three very quick ones, it would be that enablers, professional enablers in the West are present at the very beginning of a kleptocracy. They're often said that they come in later in the schemes, but no, they're present at the beginning, with obviously companies registered in offshore world, but bank accounts usually registered in the EU. The fact that a lot of the kleptocratic proceeds won't be illicit in the sense of illegal. There's a commingling of various types of funds, which make it very hard to come up with policies or regulations that can stop it, because what you're dealing with may not be actually even illegal under the laws of the country in question. Definitely corrupt. A president giving an oil contract to his son, for example, but not necessarily illegal. And finally, and I think the Masimov case showed this, was the complete obliteration in a kleptocracy of between private and public. So, as was shown in the Masimov investigation, you have major companies really paying for and organizing things for top officials. And I think this has major implications when it comes to our regulations here in the UK and elsewhere. But you can only really show that by delving deep into particular case studies and extrapolating out. At least that's my opinion.
Thank you both so much. Unfortunately, we are coming to an end now. I just wanted to say thanks to both of you for sharing. I think some of this nitty-gritty of how you actually deal with this kind of data is really fascinating for people to see. One of the interesting takeaways for me too was around actually the importance of the multi-talented team that David talked about. And I know what also comes through a lot from your work, Tom, is how having some country specialism is actually really important for being able to interpret the data properly. So I think that's kind of an interesting thing about the kinds of teams that you need to get this kind of research underway. And the other thing that really strikes me is the enormity of this, the risks that are taken often to get this data out there. And that seems like quite a big responsibility to get the most out of it as researchers and to make sure that we are really doing the analysis, gathering the evidence, and then getting it out there to influence anti-corruption. So really fascinating. Thank you both so much. Everybody else, thank you very much for joining, for the great questions. Sorry we didn't get to all of them. Do come along to our next seminar. Look out for it and sign up to the newsletter so that you can be sure not to miss the events coming up and the research that's coming out. Thank you very much.